My name is Jacqueline. I'm really happy to chair this session today on histories at Memorialisation. We've got four presenters. It will be for 15 with findings and we've got quite a time to keep time. I will announce when there's 2 minutes to go for presenters. We have three of the presenters will be in this room, and we've got Jacqueline Wilson presenting on the Zoom. So hopefully there's no technical hiccups, but please do bear with me as we're walking through that. Just a little bit for the online participants on Zoom, just a couple of notes on etiquette. Please keep your, sorry, I know there's a camera up here, so I'm looking for it. Please keep your audio on mute during presentations. I encourage you, if you want to put your camera on for the Q&A, or you're welcome to do so. People online, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat after the presentation, and I'll try and moderate to answer questions that come online and in the room. And I believe that is it for now. I'm going to now hand over to the first presentation. So Bree, Carlton and McKinnon talking about Yarra Colonial Carceral. And I will hand over to you, Bree.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by just acknowledging that you're on the land of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respect to others present and any First Nations people present in the room this morning. I'd also just like to give a warning that I'm going to make reference to, the paper includes references to Aboriginal people who have passed away. So, Australia's violent and traumatic histories are commonly buried and erased. This is particularly true of those concerning Aboriginal people and communities where their subjection and oppression was central to the colonial project of land and territory acquisition. And thus, this violence was widespread and relentless. Here on Wurundjeri country, the space that became known as Yarra Park was a site chosen by colonists for the early design and imposition of colonial social control and carceral institutions. Yarra Bend is a sprawling parkland bordered by deep, winding waterways and beset by ghostly remnants that represent a jigsaw puzzle-like contested and troubled past. The location is approximately 3 kilometres north from here and comprises 260 hectares of land bordered by the 12-kilometre long flowing Birrarung, Yarra River, that envelopes the parklands. Yarra Bend is unique as a site of violence. Colonial controls imposed upon Wurundjeri access to country, along with violent practices of dispersal and displacement in this space, saw the development of multiple closed institutions over the space of 180 plus years. And this includes Thomas Emling Psychiatric Unit, which is still in operation since 2000. So this paper is based on a larger collaborative project that I'm working on with Crystal and others that is focused upon this site. So today we're presenting some preliminary framing and observations based on some work that we've been doing in terms of field site visits, archival research, and reviews of the literature. So the future methodological development of this project will be conducted in direct consultation with the Wurundjeri Wurrung community. And the aim is to reconstruct subjugated accounts of place and space through relating accounts and stories reflecting Aboriginal resistance and challenges to the troubled violence associated with ongoing settler occupation of Aboriginal land in a specific geographical location. So our approach will be to identify key historical moments in what is a complex and largely underdocumented history. These key moments will be selected to firstly highlight the intersections between settler colonial project and the use of these institutions over time, and secondly, to advance understandings of how resistance, particularly by Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, has complicated and shaped the evolution of carceral geography in this particular site. So we argue that these stories and histories have in many ways, together directly, whether directly or indirectly, have also animated contemporary anti-carceral struggles, such as those that have mobilised large cross-sections of community to the gates of Fairlie and surrounding parklands in the 80s and 90s. So it's critical to outline some of the theoretical and conceptual interventions central to this project. First, it is inadequate to examine histories of confinement and carceral networks without centering what Irene Watson would call the original violence of invasion. It's not enough to simply acknowledge that Yarra Bend is a site of violence and unceded sovereign Indigenous lands. We argue that continuous occupation of these lands by colonial forces is inextricable from institutions of confinement built there and, of course, elsewhere. Second, the nuance of entanglement of colonial occupation of Indigenous lands and territories and the use of these institutions to maintain this control and power need to be observed and unpacked if we are to understand sites of confinement in places where, as Patrick Wolfe may say, the settler came to stay and where colonialism never ended. So today we're drawing out in a very brief and general way, because we don't have much time, some of this history to demonstrate these interventions we are making and to gesture towards future work undertaken in this project. So we'll then sort of segue to a bit of a conclusion to focus on some of the protests at Fairlie in the context of some of these broader conceptual framings that I'm talking about today. So I just want to, I'm going to overburden you with slides, but I think it's just useful to have an actual image of what the site looks like. And this is a map that was from the State Library Victoria, and it's actually, it was taken at a time, like it was made at a time in 1930 where there was a decommissioning of the asylum and they were trying to kind of repurpose the site as a recreational community, like for recreational community use. Okay, so the juncture of Birrarung and Mary waterways, or Mary Creek, marks a significant gathering place for Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and neighbouring clans used for meeting, trade, ceremony and settling disputes. So prior to colonial invasion and for the occupation of the area, the clans were able to come and go whenever they needed or desired. So during the 1830s and 1840s, there was an intense solidification of the colonial efforts to develop the metropole of Melbourne. And this led to coordinated efforts to disperse Aboriginal people out of the space. And Yarra Bend was one of the spaces that was actually designated to sort of keep people within in 1842. So the deep, rich orange-brown waterways of Birrarung, and you can see how they wind around the park in that image. I know it's a bit hard to see due to the colour, but it was basically used as a border to separate Aboriginal people from the township. Wurundjeri elder Auntie Margaret Gardner, who's now passed away, relates Wurundjeri accounts of deterritorialisation from 1834 onwards. And this is a quote: Wurundjeri fully occupied the site where Melbourne City now is. For obvious reasons, the colony did not want Wurundjeri too close to what was going to be an economic centre of Victoria. You don't want the people you've usurped to make a claim through inhabitation to an area you want. So they sent us out to the countryside to be out of sight and eventually out of mind. From 1834, the parkland was overtaken by an evolving carceral network specifically directed towards Aboriginal people, including the Mary Creek Protectorate Station and the Native Police Headquarters and the Mary Creek Aboriginal School. 14 years later, the designation of space as solely for Indigenous confinement shifted when in 1848, the Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum opened, and it was built in very close proximity to the Aboriginal School. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, the building of these institutions continued. Yarra Bend Asylum opened in 1848. In 1868, it was reported to hold 1,280 inmates, which is quite a large number. It stayed there at Yarra Bend 79 years until 1927, though it closed in 1910. It took about 17 years before the final patients were moved to Mont Albert Asylum. By this time, without state investment in its upkeep, the buildings and the gardens were in disrepair and decay. So much of the structures were demolished and buried beneath the ground following its closure. So the Fairhaven Infectious Diseases Clinic then opened in 1927, using some of the remaining structures of the asylum. It operated until 1956, when the doors of Victoria's first women's prison fairly opened, comprising some of the remaining buildings of the asylum. Between 1973 and 1977, the Eastern Freeway was constructed to link outer eastern suburbs to Melbourne. The construction of the freeway ripped through the middle of the park, altering the confluence of Birrarung and the Mary waterways. Shockingly, it's believed that the final resting place of Bilberry Nungarita, a Rawundjeri Woiwurrung clan headman, was resultingly desecrated. Known and remembered for his diplomacy and conciliation in the face of colonial violence, he passed due to respiratory disease on the 10th of August in 1846 near the Protectorate Station. So that gives you an idea of the different institutions. So this project speaks to the broader field of prison tourism and sites of conscience, which is dedicated to a growing focus on the politics of repurposing and memorialisation of institutional sites that hold histories and experiences of trauma and violence. So there's much that is really valuable about this body of work, but what we would argue is that there's a tendency for some of the work to obfuscate the contemporaneous manifestations of settler colonialism, which is a set of structures, not events. So our project speaks to the strong body of Aboriginal activist scholarship, documenting and making sense of these historical and continuing struggles against settler colonialism in Australia. So this means more than simply acknowledging that the land is stolen and that this is a space where colonial occupation occurred. Advancing knowledge in this area requires highlighting the understanding and intersection between the colonial project and the use of closed institutions over time and within the evolving landscapes and carceral geographies that are specific to locations like Yarra Bend. So I'm just trying to, how much time have I got there? 5 minutes, okay. So I might get to the end of it. So I wanted to, setting up that framing, and I think some of the sort of broader frameworks we're using around decolonial geographies and also abolition geography, which is a concept that is the subject of the writings that have just been published by Ruth Wilson-Gilmore, looking at the way that sort of carceral networks evolve in relation to racial capitalism and using that knowledge to inform how we dismantle those structures in the present and work towards abolition. And I want to sort of jump to the Fairley prison protest, which I know some of you who know the work that I've done with Emma Russell that's really focused on this sort of moment in time, or a series of moments over the 80s and 90s in time, where the community and coalitions of people that were really engaged in a social movement at the time were brought to this space. So it wasn't just about women against prison and abolition feminist organising. And I think now going to sort of unpack this more. I think that there's an opportunity here to really develop this work in terms of looking at the significance, because when I was doing that research a while ago, I just didn't look at the whole holistic history of the site. And now that I look at the way the coalitions sort of came to the prison gates around that space, really highlights the kind of connections, how these kind of anti-institutional demonstrations have really mobilised in this space. And it's interesting to think about how that happens in a contemporary context and what possibilities that raises for future kind of abolition work or anti-carceral work. And I just recently received a whole series, we're trying to create an archive out of this material in relation to Fairley, and there's some exhibits that are on display in the art launch that you'll see later today. But Catherine Gow, who was one of the main organisers, gave me all the banners and the t-shirts from these protests, and there were Aboriginal flags that were donated to the site. The Rawundjeri elders came down to the site in support, and there were unions present, there was the whole coalition involved in organising that were engaged in, at the time, anti-Jeff Kennett demonstrations. So I feel like the connection between those kind of anti-carceral expressions in the space really needs to be understood in the broader context of that history. So I'll just stop there because you've got 2 minutes. You're done. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. And yeah, oh yeah, I'll just say quickly, I wanted to include these photographs because this was at a moment where the Fairlie Women's Prison was actually demolished and they were building the private women's prison out at Deer Park. And I think that was a kind of real twist in the way that the anti-prison movement started thinking about racial capitalism in relation to the massive privatisation experiment that was happening in Victoria, in Deer Park, you know, with the construction of the Deer Park prison at the time. And the organisers behind People's Justice Alliance, who were doing a lot of death in custody advocacy and prison advocacy at the time, went back to this site where Fairlie was demolished. And as you can see, there's nothing there. And made like a little memorial sign because there is nothing there. There was a plaque that was attached to the banners attached to the asylum pillar that was removed from where the asylum used to be and put on the side of the road. It's still there if you want to go and look at it. It looks like a colonial monument. And it did have a plaque recognising the lunatic asylum and Fairlie Women's Prison, but periodically it gets stolen. Sometimes the council replace it, but there's no memorials in relation to Fairlie Women's Prison. And I just think that it's incredible that the site that was so significant in the history of prison activism and the amount of people that mobilised in that space, for there to be no kind of memorial in that space in recognition of the women who were in that prison is quite significant. So I'll just end on that note.
Thanks, Bree and Crystal. I'll actually just we have about this might not even be on. We have about 5 minutes for some questions. If there's anyone in the room, please ask a question. I might bring the microphone to you so people on the Zoom can hear. If there's anyone on the Zoom that has a question, please raise your hand and please raise your hand. Any questions? Sorry, just bear with me. Sorry, does anyone have any questions for Bree and Crystal in the room? No? I just might ask a question, Bree. I'm really interested. You sort of mentioned in sort of the first wave of your research into Fairlie Women's Prison that you hadn't kind of looked at this more full and interwoven, and as you talk about this colonial carceral continuum, as well as, you know, the enduring sovereign lands that it's on. And you mentioned at the end in terms of sort of archiving work that you're going to be doing, and yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what the project is going to be doing moving forward. You sort of touched on it towards the end, but I'd love to hear a bit more.
You mean with the archives?
Yeah. Are you archiving sort of the whole, like you did mention in relation to Fairlie, but whether the other histories and these interweaved histories that you're speaking about, are you doing archival work within that as well? I'll give you the microphone so Zoom can hear. Sorry. Great.
Thanks. One of the things that we wanted to achieve with that project that we never really got around to due to COVID and everything was to create an archive made up of the Fairlie diaries and all of the photographs to do with that protest that was documented over a 6-month period.
there's a whole raft of material that has been curated by women involved and other, various people involved in that movement have collected over the years. And we've started looking into ways of preserving that. Some of that material is actually going to be on display in the art exhibition this afternoon, the Fairley Diaries and the images from the vigil itself, which was camped outside the prison for 6 months, is going to be on display today. So maybe even by the break, you might be able to go down there and have a look at that. We just want to create a social movements archive that relates to those particular projects, because there was a lot of work done around Fairley in particular, and women's prisons and the privatisation of prisons and the deaths that occurred due to the hanging points in Port Phillip prison following on from the opening of that private prison. People have heaps of material. So it's a process that is unfunded at this stage, but I probably will have to look into getting funding because there's a lot of material, basically. So yeah, that's a sort of formative process.
Yes, you've got your hand up. I'll pass you the microphone.
Oh. Thank you. That was very interesting. I just want to pick up on a comment you made about I guess the lack of settler colonial sort of focus or agendas in sort of memorialization and sites of conscience kind of literature. You said it kind of in passing, but I'm really interested in what you make of it and whether or not the project is taking more direct sort of approach to bringing those bodies of work together.
Thanks. And you've got about
I don't entirely understand your question, but I guess what we were thinking through is also about people gesture towards, acknowledgements of country, or acknowledge that, whose land it is, without looking at that these institutions themselves are engaging in ongoing land theft. And so it's like this intertwined colonial systems that they're also a part of in the ongoing colonialism and ongoing dispossession. So we're trying to think through those sort of theoretical frameworks to actually unpack what's going on there and placing them within it too, rather than just saying like, this is one true country, this is, and then moving on from there. So trying to do that kind of conceptual and theoretical work around putting those all together into how that's happening. Yeah.
Can I just add to that too? Like in relation to that space, there's been lots of historical work that has been done around the protectorate era, the asylum, things like that. But it is so through this kind of like siloed sort of mindset of kind of going, let's look at this institution. Oh, there's not much about Aboriginal people. They must have been in the institution. They're not going to be in the archives in the way that you would imagine. Those histories are really hard to you have to do a process of excavation.
People, there's like these really, I won't say simplistic, but not very nuanced ways of looking at things, saying this is an Indigenous institution, this is a non-Indigenous one. And, the asylum and these other places are also a part of the ways that Aboriginal people were placed in these institutions too. And that's a part of it as well. I don't think it's too simplistic to just go, protectorate, school, Indigenous, these things, non-Indigenous, and not see the way that they're all connected and interconnected.
I think you're picking up on a methodological challenge as well, like what you're saying about the archives. There's like a story there that's not actually archived.
Well, it is, it's just you got to know how to read it. Yeah. So it's like,
There's plenty there. Sorry, Crystal, to cut you off. I am just going to keep everyone from the time, just so that everyone has time to speak. And then if we've got some time at the end to pick up some of those threads, that would be great. Thank you, Bree and Crystal. Next, we're going to go to Jacqueline Wilson, who is joining us on the Zoom. And the title of her presentation is Get Your Facts Straight, Girlie, Academic Activism and the Total Institution. And Jacqueline, I will just, so that you can see me, I'm going to, I'll give you a 2-minute call when there's 2 minutes to go, just so you know. So I'll hand it over to you, Jackie.
Yep, okay, can you hear me okay and see me, no?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right, because I got my camera on, but it's not working. All right. I mean, it might be working at your end. It was working before. Okay. All right. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Wathaurong land and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, but I also want to acknowledge all the Aboriginal people that are here at the conference today, and especially those people who are presenting and attending the conference. Now, there are some things I want to say, so I'll just read out my paper and get started. Okay. So it's spring 2001, it's 8 o'clock in the evening, and I'm walking to my car in the car park of the Coburg Historical Society, where I've spent several hours examining records and artefacts originating from the recently decommissioned Pentridge prison, research for my honours thesis in sociology criminology. Just as I reached my car, the Historical Society president, a former governor of security at Pentridge, and therefore, by his own estimation at least, a paragon of the criminal justice system, marches up to me. He launches into a tirade delivered from less than a metre away about what he sees as my misguided socialistic agenda, as evinced by the sort of questions I've been asking him about the operational life of the prison. After perhaps 3 minutes, a long time when you're being browbeaten in a dark car park, he finishes off by prodding his finger almost in my face and yells, "Get your facts straight, girlie, just get your facts straight." Message delivered, he then turns and marches off to his own car, leaving me to contemplate the nature and significance of what I've just experienced and how it might fit into my understanding of life in Her Majesty's Prison, Pentridge. Pentridge had been decommissioned just a few years previously. It was now undergoing redevelopment as a real estate project, a process that prompted me to take it to make it the topic of my honours thesis, and in particular attempt to glean by various avenues of inference the nature of inmates' experiences whilst inside. My aim was to compare and contrast those implied narratives with the emerging quasi-official history of the site as promoted by my car park admonisher and his former colleagues, and embraced by the real estate developers. Now, just for those of you who don't know Pentridge or who are not familiar with the site, at that time it had the highest murder-suicide rate of any prison in Australia. The mere fact of my expressing an interest in the experiences of inmates was enough to provoke his remarks about my socialistic agenda. And that, as much as anything, spurred me to pursue what would become my ongoing research interest, the nature of carceral institutions as communities of individuals, as social and cultural entities within neighbourhoods, and the social memory, and as venues for wholesale oppression and injustice. My original motivation for this avenue of research was a mixture of academic and personal considerations. As a former ward of the state of Victoria, with a history of repeatedly going into care as a child, I had a natural interest in total institutions. Further, my brother had been an inmate of Pentridge some years before it closed. I had graduated with sociology and history majors, so those experiences blended well with my academic aspirations, or so I thought. Having encountered the institutional gatekeepers on site, I now found myself facing a different sort of obstacle within the academy, as a succession of academics assured me, in no uncertain terms, that I was on a track to nowhere. Shortly after beginning my PhD in ethnographic study of decommissioned prison sites across Australia, I was taken aside in the Monash University History Department and told explicitly, "Stop talking about being a ward of the state. It has nothing to do with history." Such advice admittedly lacked the brute force of my car park haranguing, but in the context of an institution of higher learning delivered to a postgrad at the bare beginnings of what she hoped to be her career, it was hardly less intimidating. It was my first intimidation of a headwind I would face for much of my academic career, a continuation in a way of the headwind I had encountered throughout my upbringing, comprising a lack of acceptance, not unusual for state wards, indifference and outright rejection. The academic version amounted to an invalidation of my lived experience as a legitimate research source and was, as I would learn, typical of the negation of the experience of care leavers in general as potential contributors to an area of study in which they were the core stakeholders. The connection between state wards and prisons may seem obscure, but in many ways it is direct and close. The process of becoming a ward began with an appearance in the magistrate's court, where the proceedings were conducted almost exactly like criminal cases, and were experienced as such by the hapless subject, especially since many wards, having been mandated by the court to be taken into the care of the government, went straight from there into institutions such as Baltara, where my brother was, Tirana, Winlayton or Parramatta, euphemistically called home, or training centres or schools, but in reality they were jails. It is a matter of record since both the Forgotten Australian Senate inquiry of 2004 and the more recent Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse that most of the children in such homes were not only housed alongside young inmates who were incarcerated for criminal offences, but were treated no differently by the system and its on-site facilitators. And this is very recent history and it is ongoing history. In fact, a number of former wards have had to apply in recent years to have their criminal records expunged. My friend Frank Golding was charged with child neglect when he was 2 years old. Not all care leavers, it should be noted, are former wards of the state, but in the great majority of cases, the care into which they were delivered still involved total institutions of one sort or another. Most often these were orphanages, where they were often detained for years while their still living parents tried in vain to have them released. Many were told those parents had permanently abandoned them when they had not. The 2004 Senate inquiry was conducted in the third year of my PhD candidature and was in large part a result of the influence of care leaver activist groups, and it wouldn't have happened without us. And lest we fall into the mindset of regarding care leavers as a statistically insignificant minority of this country, we should keep in mind that the 2004 inquiry identified 500,000 Australians who had been in care, approximately 5% of the population at that time. At the same time as I was being urged to abandon my interest in state wardship, I was increasing my involvement with care leaver groups outside the academy, and it is to the credit of the support of those groups provided that I not only affirmed my scholarly pursuits in the field, but began gradually to turn that scholarship into activism within the academy. Importantly, I must say that some support has originated from within the academy over the years. I was never battling all alone. But much of that recognition eventuated after I began to establish a track record, and no small amount of it has come from overseas, where progress in the field has been much quicker than that in Australia. The pushback in Australia has at times been almost comical, especially from ideologically motivated individuals outside or on the fringes of the academy. At the height of the so-called history wars about 12 years ago, I was among a group of social historians taken to task by the Murdoch columnist Miranda Devine. I was among a group there which had our papers singled out at a conference in Tasmania on prison sites. And one of the papers I'd authored, the title of that paper was published in The Sun, and Miranda Devine took it to task just on the actual title. She hadn't actually read the paper or listened to it. It had the word graffiti and gender in it, and that was enough to get her very upset. And it was quite a big article that was devoted to that. So in my case, she singled out a conference paper I'd authored on the grounds of the title alone, as I said. And since it had not yet been presented, she couldn't have had any idea of its real content, but it didn't stop her. Perhaps she detected the same socialistic agenda that had so infuriated the president of the Coburg Historical Society. My activism began as an effort to restore the hidden voices and narratives of myriad anonymous former inmates. From there, it evolved to contribute to the establishment of official inquiries into the experiences of those who had been in state care. It culminated most recently in the creation of an ongoing project within the Academy to improve educational opportunities for care leavers. This project, undertaken with a large grant from an industry partner, has broken new ground in firstly identifying and quantifying the number of care leavers entering higher education for the first time, but it also provided them with both material support in the form of scholarships, plus counselling and the specialist assistance they need to help ensure completion of their courses. They are, in fact, a group that's been identified as having the smallest participation in higher education in this country. The project also spurred Education Department policy changes to help attract more care leavers into higher education. Today, an insider research methodology, while still sometimes questioned, has become broadly acknowledged as a valid investigative tool. Substantive participation of care leavers is becoming more valued. We're not merely subjects anymore to be surveyed or interviewed, but we are investigators in our own right. I'm a chief investigator on 2 ARC discovery research projects looking at issues pertinent to care leavers' rights and the contribution of care leaver activists to the historical record. I have been the research subject when I was an adolescent in state care with a master's student from the University of Melbourne who arrived in a brand new car and then questioned me about how I was going to cope as a homeless student. I was in a place called Hope Street Shelter. They always have names like Hope Street, that sort of thing. She went off to finish her master's degree and I never really knew what became of that research. I just simply signed a form as a 15-year-old. So despite the headwind, in the end, I can be reasonably confident that I did indeed get my facts straight. And I also managed to show that having been awarded the state did have something to do with history, and it certainly has a lot to do with criminology. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. And beautifully defined. We've got about 5 minutes for questions.
My nose keeps running.
If there's anybody in the room that has a question for Jacqueline or anyone on the Zoom.
Oh, that's good. We can just go straight to the next paper.
Got a question in the room.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for that really powerful presentation. The point you made about your experience as a 15-year-old, having your lived trauma harvested for somebody's research ends and then never finding out about that. You speak of that as if it's in the past tense. I think sadly and shamefully it's still very much in the present tense. Would you comment on that? Just is that something in your view that still goes on, and what do we need to do and say about that to make sure it doesn't?
Yeah, no, absolutely, it still goes on. I recently published a paper about it. I'm very concerned about children in out-of-home care today, you know, in the past and today, who are still the subject of research projects. And in fact, I've written several papers about it. I can't remember which journals they're in, but they're all Q1 journals. I did something with Philip Mendes at Monash University and a couple of other things. So you're absolutely right, it's ongoing. And this is something that was also raised at the Royal Commission into sexual abuse of children in institutional care, and was talked about a lot. So I'm not sure that we're making a lot of headway there. It's very difficult, and ethics boards and whatever are still slow to even acknowledge children in out-of-home care as a particularly vulnerable group. You've got to ask ourselves the question, what does all this research actually do for those people in those places? I guess I just raised it because it didn't do anything for me. I continued to be a homeless student. You know, I continued to have to, what that person was doing. I was the only person who was going to school. So I hope that answers some of your question.
Thanks. Any other questions? Anyone got a question in the chat on Zoom?
Okay.
All right, thank you so much, Jacqueline.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'd first of all like to start by acknowledging the sovereignty of the Wurundjeri peoples, as well as the Wiradjuri and Ngātahi peoples on whose land this research was conducted. And I'll also be discussing deceased First Nations peoples. I'd also like just to give a quick plug to this education booklet, Incarceration, Migration and Indigenous Sovereignty. Some of the contributors are Crystal McKinnon, Emma Russell and Rise, and it centres Indigenous sovereignty to anti-carceral practices, and there's some copies there by the door, and there's it's also available free online as well. Okay, so I'll get into the paper. What I do in this paper is analyse Dubbo, in Dubbo, Australia, and Dunedin, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And despite the material presence of settler colonisation in tourist sites and built landscapes of Dubbo and Dunedin, city branding and the staging of history in these sites works to discursively and institutionally forget these cities' violent and racist settler colonial histories. I contextualise the old Dubbo jail and Dunedin prison in historical and contemporary carceral geography practices of city building and city branding, which constitutes an apparatus of forgetting, and I'm using the term apparatus in a Foucauldian sense. This apparatus is reproduced by city branding, which forecloses an engagement with the role of prisons in dispossessing Indigenous peoples from land and the role of prison labour in settler city building. Focusing on these case sites illustrates how the afterlives of colonial prisons continue into the present amidst attempts to overwrite Indigenous landscapes and histories. Tracy Vanivanawama argues that heritage and tourist sites in Australia are spaces produced by settler colonial happenings. So that is, if history happens, it happens only for settlers. These happenings form, you're not hearing me, okay? Yep. These happenings form meta-narrative in settler landscapes where the reporting of history ratifies Indigenous, quote, dispossession and spatial one, constantly implementing narratives of terra nullius, end quote. For Vanivanawama, it is important to examine, quote, history in place, the way landscapes can be read as historical texts and the manner in which memory markers in colonial landscapes interact with surrounding spaces to affirm and embed historical meta-narratives, end quote. I read the tourist and carceral geographies of Dubbo and Dunedin as materialising meta-narratives of forgetting, and it's therefore constituting landscape texts of settler colonisation. I locate myself as a participant in these meta-narratives and processes of settler colonisation. I was born in Dubbo and resided there for most of my life. My family are Irish, Scottish and English convict descendants who settled in Dubbo, Yarra and Bulla in regional New South Wales. I was socialised in an environment where prisons are a site of trauma and pain and have loved ones who experience living with a criminal record. And this experience informs my analysis of the two case sites. At the same time, my mobility in being able to move through rural towns and have a sense of belonging in the place, to see the English names of my dad and my brothers and street names in Sydney, both Sydney, where I moved for my university, and in Dunedin, where I later worked, reinforces cultural safety for me. So onto the first case site. Dubbo is located on Wiradjuri country and is roughly in the centre of New South Wales and is part of the Central West and Arana regions. The Wiradjuri Nation is one of the largest First Nations in New South Wales, and Dubbo is the largest city in this region with a population of approximately 40,000. And it's a central hub for business, tourism, health and education in the area. The Tabagal Wiradjuri peoples and elders are the local custodians of Dubbo. The Dubbo Regional Council manages tourism branding through the Dubbo Region Discovery app and the Dubbo Region website, and has recently launched Dubbo Education International Ready project, which aims to make Dubbo quite the #1 inland visitor destination in New South Wales and Australia, both for Australian families and international visitors to New South Wales. The jail features prominently in its branding on the Dubbo region. This is a photo from the jail from the airport. And the Discovery app includes a gamified tourist experience where, quote, 2 inmates have escaped the old Dubbo jail and hidden the Dubbo region's treasures throughout the CDB, end quote. In the new Destination Dubbo project, the jail will be the centre of the public heritage plaza. And while Wiradjuri heritage forms part of the new plan, for instance, in the proposed Dubbo Wiradjuri Tourism Centre, First Nations heritage and presence is marginal and almost entirely absent in some places. So the old Dubbo jail deploys an interactive visitor experience involving costume demonstrations, video and multimedia, props and puzzles, and at one time completely terrifying life-size animatronic puppets of the jailers and prisoners. It's won a number of heritage awards throughout its operation as a tourist destination, most recently winning the 2023 winner of National Heritage Awards Education and Interpretation. And it's one of the most visited sites in Dubbo. The origins of the jail are intimately connected to the development of the township of Dubbo, as the jail was one of the first buildings established in 1847, along with a port and police station. The town grew around this carceral infrastructure located in what was to become the main street, Macquarie Street. Country influenced the location of the jail, and hence the town on the eastern side of the Macquarie River, or Wumble, which has the higher bank and is therefore less prone to flooding. Ironically, the decision to locate these carceral sites in Dubbo rather than nearby Wellington was due to Wellington's, at the time, prosperity and desirability as a residential settlement. Now that Wellington is in decline, it has recently opened a new jail serving the Yarra region. Local historian Bill Hornach states that the main crimes during the 1840s were illicit manufacture of spirits, brawls through drunkenness on district properties, and cattle stealing. Squatters such as Robert Dale-Humphrey and John Moore had input into the location of the jail and the development of the town. Squatting was technically illegal but was permitted as part of what Wolfe describes as laissez-faire settler colonisation, where settlement enabled Crown possession, and Dubbo itself is named after a squatters' run. The restoration and representation of the jail as a heritage site focuses on the latter part of the 19th century, despite the jail operating as a remand centre for much of the 20th century. And the temporal period is reinforced of the late 1800s is reinforced in the case studies of the prisoners presented in the cells and elsewhere on the site, the props displayed, the costumes worn by the demonstrators, and the choice to restore the gallows to the site. In a portable cell, one of the original wooden lockups used prior to the stone building was a display called the Stretch in Time. This is part of the gamified experience of visiting the jail. And this display is a dual timeline of both the establishment of Australia. The establishment of Australia is 1788 penal colony. The establishment of Dubbo is the first jail, and there's a few items about the opening of the jail as a heritage site, and then Wellington being announced site for a new major prison in the region. Invasion, settler violence, and criminalisation of First Nations, or reference to First Nations at all, are not included in the timeline. Some of the case studies in the site do feature First Nations. For instance, there's an exhibit on Charlie Brown, or Jackie Underwood, who was hung as part of the Very Long Massacre, and Albert, another First Nations person, who was executed in the jail. Albert's grave is marked in the prison, around by two other identified prisoners in a mass grave that was located at a later time. There's also Paddy, a police tracker, who's featured in an exhibit elsewhere. And in the remand cells, there's a case study of Arthur Waters, a 15-year-old in prison for forced theft, and he was discharged in the First Offenders Act and worked with the Sinclair Aboriginal Mission. The two missions in the area near Dubbo and Wellington are not contextualised or mentioned further, thereby dislocating them from pastoral practices. Within heritage, interactive heritage sites, Building has all stated that visitors' engagement is premised on absence management. And so I argue that information provided in the exhibits manages what historical context regarding Dubbo and the 19th century visitors can engage with. And absence management, I think, is helpful for understanding that there is space given in the jail to contextualising attitudes towards poverty or mental health at the time, but there's almost no kind of contextualising information about First Nations. So Johansson and Kakaiakuix argue that a city is always rich in experiences, but only particular kinds can serve the purpose of the experience economy, and that even the most unpleasant event can be recast as an enticing experience. And so I suggest that the old Dubbo jail locks in an experience-scape of prison life to the 19th century and manages the absence and presence of settlers and First Nations in ways that take for granted the dispossessory practices foundational to settler city building. So onto the second slide. Dunedin or Oti is located in the southern part of the South Island or Te Waipounamu of New Zealand. It's located on Kaitahu land. Due to the location of the University of Otago, previous manufacturing and export industries that operated out of Tava, Dunedin was at one time a populous and prosperous town in the South Island. However, deindustrialisation and Northern population drift have meant that tourism in the town's heritage play an increasingly important role in the city's economy. For instance, Dunedin's economic development strategy notes that tourism can play a role in and can generate up to $180 million to the local community. And in a previous paper, I argued that city branding focuses on Dunedin's heritage and architecture and ignores the prison labour that was involved in building the city. Parts of the city, or much of the city, were built by Taranaki prisoners taken from Kaihaka in the North Island, after non-violently defending their homes from survey, arrested and charged without trial and forced to labour in Dunedin between 1869 and 1881. In their book, Māori Dunedin, Griffiths and Goodall outlined how the Taranaki prisoners worked on city projects, including the Botanic Garden stone walls, parts of the University of Otago, and the city road eventually named after them, Māori Road. And the prisoners were held at Dunedin prison and transported to work sites. And around 20 died during the time in Dunedin, were buried in unmarked corpus graves in the Northern Cemetery, which is one of the sites listed in Dunedin's heritage tourism. Dunedin's prison, as with other heritage buildings in Dunedin, is undergoing revitalisation to be a tourist site, to be included as part of the heritage and architecture of Dunedin. Branding information encourages visitors to unlock Dunedin's past by attending tours of the site, which involve consumers pantomiming being enclosed in cells and learning about the prison's recent history. The prison also has ghost tours, which are held at night. And there are plans to convert the quote internationally recognised rare example of a purpose-built prison courtyard into a restaurant and function space, end quote. And so I argue that the aesthetics of Dunedin's colonial history are disaggregated from the architecture of the built landscape, which is an apparatus of forgetting in order to close engagement with the role of prisons in dispossessing Māori from land. And the refashioning of Dunedin's pastoral past into an experience state present highlights how so-called dark tourism operates to affirm the progress of the present through sanitised consumptions of history. And despite this tourism still being the sensible engagement with distasteful aspects of a place's history, this engagement is nevertheless managed within a safe tourist experience that can be terminated whenever the customer desires. And this choice to opt out of history thereby returns the tourist to the security of the present. So I think I'm just about at time, and I'll just conclude by saying that the role of city branding in facilitating an apparatus for forgetting is potentially problematic for municipal authorities' capacity to engage with Indigenous histories. And that unless a resident or a visitor knows about the relationship between pastoral geographies and Indigenous dispossession, they're subject to absence management and the reaffirmation of settler colonial landscapes and that narratives. And this means that there is a burden put on designated First Nations or Indigenous tourist spaces to educate consumers about this history. So I think at that time I'll leave there.
Thanks, Holly. Really fun. So we've got time, 5 minutes for questions. I'll just stop sharing the screen. Yeah. Okay. There is a question on the chat, so I'll just ask that one first and then we can follow up. So John asks, is there scope for a possible critique of carcerality more generally in the Dubbo Regional Council region, given the expansion of prisons in Wellington?
Not within the space of the old Dubbo jail. Like as I mentioned, it's the most visited tourist site in Dubbo. I think that might be because it's literally in the centre of the town. And as I said, the town sort of built around that carceral infrastructure. But yeah, and in that exhibit that I showed, the timeline of prisons in Australia, it tends to locate sort of prisons as being in the past. In the old Dubbo jail, most of its operation took place in the 20th century. It was a remand centre, but it's represented in the site as being a site from the late 1800s. So I mean, I guess that's what I was sort of gesturing out in the conclusion, that I don't see much capacity for the site to be, like, it's won a bunch of awards and stuff, but I don't see much criticality in the presentation of pastoral histories in the site. I mean, it mentions that Australia was founded as a penal colony in 1788. That's kind of it in terms of the way that the site itself links to broader pastoral practice. I hope that answers your question.
Oh yeah, and John's also made a comment. Oh yes, you said that. There's also, can we see the comment? So sorry, John's just followed up. Yeah, and he mentions the Orion Youth Detention Centre. Well, it might be.
Yeah, it's interesting that the spatialisation of pastoral sites in juvenile justice sites in Dubbo, because originally the location of the jail in Dubbo was nearby Wellington was viewed to be more desirable as a living space. So the prison was put in Dubbo to support with no one wants to live in Dubbo, but those sort of carceral fortunes have reversed, and now that Wellington, which is about 20-30 minutes from Dubbo, now that that's declined, that's the site of this massive new prison, which created a lot of jobs in the area. There's some interesting intersections between pastoral geographies, regional development, and tourism geographies. There's some interesting intersections.
Anyone in the room have questions for Holly? Anyone else online? We still have about 5 minutes for the rest of the session, so I might, if anyone has any questions or discussions that might link the papers together, or that yes, Diana.
Wants to. So Tabitha was talking this morning about
say this directly, but really that idea of penal spectatorship, that we, you know, the gaze of a non-normalized person, is what you're talking about too, Holly, in this carceral tourism. Is there space, and is there any activism geared towards raising people's awareness of their role, our role as penal spectators, and that's not something, that's something if we are aware of, that we might choose not to participate. Is that something that's that you're aware of at all?
I mean, the site, like it's, the old Dubbo jail is present much more than the Dunedin site. It's premised on interactivity, so like almost every exhibit is about sort of getting people to be interactive. But I use some of the work of Bree and Intl to talk about that activity as being a critical. Like I remember going into one site and I could hear like these kids and a mum saying, "It's decent assault, vagrancy," and they were responding to it in an exhibit, which is like, that's what this person was like imprisoned for. So there is like there's a lot of interactivity. The site is really successful in that, but it's like, yeah, it's totally kind of a critical, and I guess in both sites as well, like they're not, I think this ties into maybe the point that Crystal and Bree were talking about in terms of like what sites are like designated Indigenous sites or non-Indigenous sites, and in both cases, the Dunedin prison and Old Dubbo jail aren't listed as like Indigenous sites or as constituting part of Indigenous heritage, and so yeah, like you really don't get a sense, and I suppose it's to be expected that like Indigenous possession is linked to practices of carcerality at all. Does that make sense?
I think memory in this case, so it's not a question. I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't know if you hear from some kind of shut up. But I just think like the fact that memory actually has a functioning, having a function here, right? So it wouldn't necessarily yield resistance as such, because it's doing the work it's meant to be doing, and for the people who do that the work for, there's almost like, yeah, we are reckoning with something really bad happening here, maybe we're not very good, but it sounds like another thing, but actually doing this, like, hey, when we're walking into the prison and we are, you know, it's not hidden, like we're participating in remembering what happened. I think that that's where the sort of conversation around, you know, what the active remembering does and what it doesn't really so important, right? Because it allows people into the sort of violent spaces as a form of recognition, without actually understanding that those things that happen there are still happening. So it almost is not really visualize the fact that and living entity, right? It continues to be, as well as invisibilizing the position, because Aboriginal sovereignty is never featured in these books. So I think expecting resistance is almost a bit naive of us, because Memorialisation does exactly what it's meant to be doing in giving people the outlet to recognize. You know what I mean? I don't know, that's it. No, that's exactly the thing, right? It's a reckoning without reckoning the way that we're thinking about it for. And so, yeah, I mean, if you shut them down and say, oh, well, they're going to me, and you say, hey, let's see, we should know what happened. It's but opening them up, allowing for that kind of discussion, I think in some ways, you know what I mean? I don't know, that's what I see as important.
Almost time, so we might wrap up the session, and maybe just another round of applause for all of our participants. Thanks everyone.